The Toyota pickup truck is one of the most feared weapons on the modern battlefield. No, seriously, it is. From Africa to the Middle East and everywhere in between, lightweight Toyota pickup trucks and other similar models have been converted from a reliable means of transportation into some of the most important weapons in rebel groups, terrorist organizations, and dictators the world over. But how do these simple, cheap trucks become weapons of war? And why? If you've ever seen footage from a battlefield in Africa, the Middle East, or Southern Europe, you've probably seen images of Toyota trucks with weapons mounted on them. These pickup trucks are some of the most ubiquitous and feared weapons systems among militaries and armed groups with limited budgets. But how did they come about? The current U.S. military term for civilian-made vehicles repurposed for military is called technicals. The term itself came about during the early 1990s when the UN was struggling to get aid to those in need in Somalia. UN aid groups were not allowed to carry weapons, but they needed protection from the groups of armed bandits roaming the streets and countryside. With no one else to turn to, aid groups hired local warlords to provide protection. When these convoys would leave, the warlords would have their troops ride in modified Toyota Helix or Land Cruiser pickup trucks. These trucks usually carried about a squad of infantry or a heavy weapon like a machine gun. These aid groups paid for their services with the line of technical assistance on their billing statements, hence the term technical was born. But how do these groups turn a conventional pickup truck into a weapon of war? Before diving deep into the modifications different groups have made to pickup trucks, it's important to note that not all technicals are exclusively Toyota Helix or Land Cruiser trucks. Numerous other makes and models have been modified, including Nissan, Hyundai, Ford, and Chevrolet, among others. However, it is without question that these two models of Toyota are the most common types of trucks turned into military vehicles. But what sort of weapons do groups put on these things? The most common modification military groups make to the Toyota is adding a general-purpose machine gun or a heavy machine gun. Most machine guns of all types in conflict zones in the Middle East and Africa are of Soviet or Chinese origin, including PK, PKM, or PKP families of machine guns. Rebel groups that have been supplied by the US or NATO will occasionally see machine guns used in NATO, like FN or Browning-type machine guns. However, Eastern Bloc weapons dominate the space due to their quantity, low tolerances, and available ammunition. For heavy machine guns, many technicals are armed with the Soviet DSHK and its various copies and derivatives. Some groups in Africa have been noted to sport American .50 caliber machine guns, but these are not nearly as common. Regardless of the machine gun system they carry, these kinds of technicals are the most common. This is because there are usually few modifications made beyond mounting the machine gun. Groups prefer these technicals to have less stuff on them to make it easier for infantry to dismount and remount in combat, as they are sort of like the de facto battle taxi. But what about if groups need something heavier? Though machine guns are the most common type of system, rebel groups and terrorists also use technicals to carry out various military functions that normal militaries have purpose-built weapons for. One great example is using technicals as a mobile anti-air weapon. By taking usually outdated Soviet or Chinese anti-aircraft guns like the multi-barreled ZSU or ZU family of guns, many groups can bring to bear a mobile and easily hidden system. In fact, these types of technicals are very common in the Middle East since they will probably not take out a fast-moving jet. There have been numerous instances of technicals in Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan taking out low-flying helicopters with cannon fire. Of course, in order to shoot the weapon properly, the pickup truck has to be balanced correctly. If it's not, the operator risks flipping the vehicle over entirely. To balance the truck, it is common to not only mount the anti-aircraft gun to the bed, but weigh down the truck with ammunition or sandbags. By lowering the truck's center of gravity, there's less chance of tipping it over when shooting in automatic fire modes. Now, Toyota trucks can not only take out helicopters, they can also take out tanks. But how? Thanks to an invention called a recoilless rifle, militaries on a budget can turn a simple pickup truck into a feared tank hunting machine. A recoilless rifle is kind of a bazooka where it fires a large rocket-type projectile. There are compensators in the rear of the weapon that allow gases to escape so there is no recoil. This means the weapon can be fired in tight spaces or light vehicles without fear of tipping the truck over. Many paramilitary groups have outfitted technicals with recoilless rifles. This allows them to take out tanks and armored vehicles with the ability to displace from enemy return fire quickly. In addition to recoilless rifles, these groups often have anti-tank guided missiles on board, but these are less common due to their expense and higher level of training required. However, there are weapon systems that groups use that require much less training but can still do a lot of damage. Known as multiple launch rocket systems, or MLRS, these unguided rockets are like a poor man's artillery battery. Because traditional artillery systems are expensive, require extensive training, and a steady supply of ammunition not readily made at home, they're not common in fledgling militaries and terrorist groups. However, unguided rocket systems of Russian and Chinese origin are quite common in technicals. Among MLRS, there are various versions available, including single-shot, multiple-tube, and homemade rockets. In battlefields where there have been large numbers of downed aircraft, like Libya and Syria, it has also been documented that groups have pulled rocket pods off of downed helicopters and then put them on the back of a technical. It's pretty ingenious and a good use of resources, honestly. But how do groups modify them to actually use these weapons? Besides simple mounting systems, a few modifications are often made. However, adding what American troops called hillbilly armor is common. Hillbilly armor is basically any type of armor plating or scraps a group can find laying around the battlefield to weld to the chassis. While this armor's protection is limited, some groups have taken serious measures in recent years to make technicals more survivable. When ISIS controlled huge chunks of Iraq and Syria, they created a whole host of weapons factories to supply the caliphate with arms. In these factories, ISIS led the way in making bigger and better technicals. Besides making fully armored turrets that surrounded anti-aircraft guns or heavy machine guns, ISIS also created fully armored technicals. These vehicles look just like the Israeli armored bulldozer, with thick metal armor and cages surrounding them. While some of these heavily armored technicals were made as gun trucks, the vast majority were vehicle-borne suicide vehicles with machine gun cupolas, so a gunner could suppress enemy fire as the driver finished their one-way trip. But while technicals are a staple in the Middle East and Africa, the US and the UK have also used them. While the origins of Western use of technicals date back to World War I, they largely fell out of favor after the Cold War. However, during the War on Terror, Western Special Operations Forces have been noted to use technicals too. Because a Toyota pickup is much less suspicious than an American Humvee, Spec Ops groups would convert these trucks into stealth vehicles. By taking out almost all of the interior and exterior lighting besides the headlights, the alarms, and adding communications equipment, American Green Berets and SEALs could more easily blend in with the locals. But how can using technicals really make a difference when confronting a side that possesses modern tanks and armored vehicles? Arguably, the most famous case of technicals prevailing on the battlefield was the infamous Toyota War of 1987. During this several-month conflict, the Chadian military dealt Libya one of the greatest military defeats in history, thanks to Toyota. But how? Though the Toyota War is described as its own conflict, it was actually just the final phase of a longer 9-year conflict between Libya and Chad over the northern portion of Chad's territory. In the beginning, the heavily armed and well-supplied Libyan army easily swept the disorganized and under-equipped Chadian forces aside and occupied the region. France then stepped in and provided significant material support and training. However, the Chadians were used to using swift cavalry tactics on horseback and camel. Of course, doing so against Libyan tanks and armored vehicles was not an option, so the French did the next best thing. The French government donated 400 Toyota Land Cruisers, along with enough recoilless rifles and machine guns to turn each one into a mobile tank killer. With a core group of several 100,000 volunteers, the Chadian forces decide to bring their old tactics to bear with a new mode of transportation. What resulted was the Battle of Fada and the beginning of the end of the war. On January 2, 1987, the Chadians struck an isolated Libyan outpost that was home to an entire armored brigade and a battalion of Chadians that had sided with Libya. In the ensuing fight, the Chadians completely surprised the Libyans with their new weapons. Due to their speed and heavy weaponry, the Chadians were able to literally run circles around the slow and cumbersome T-55 and T-62 tanks, along with their BMP armored vehicles. While Libyan forces floundered in the mud, Chadians shot them from the side and in their rear. In the bloodbath, almost 800 Libyans were killed, 100 captured, and almost 160 tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed or captured. The Chadian victory cost just 3 Toyotas and 18 men. Despite Toyota's amazing performance at Fada, this battle took place almost 40 years ago, posing the question, are technicals still relevant on today's battlefields? Because groups that use technicals do not have the luxury of the time or money to train drivers or mechanics, converting civilian pickups into weapons is a great idea. Almost anybody can drive a vehicle, and because Toyotas are popular in these parts of the world and many people can work on them. Additionally, parts for these vehicles are also readily available and cheap. No complicated maintenance needs to be performed before or after a mission, such as on a tank or armored vehicle. Because technicals can perform a wide variety of functions, they allow under-equipped militaries to still perform many of the same functions as a more well-funded one. Reconnaissance, being a battle taxi, artillery platforms, tank hunters, and anti-air units are all now within reach of even the most cash-strapped group. For these reasons, technicals are still an integral part of today's battlefield and will remain so for generations to come. Bye for now.